political philosophers of democracy, like John Stuart Mill and so on, as well as lawyers who sometimes have the pretension of being political philosophers, say that the rule of law is the guarantee of all the other rights. I would assert that there's something that is fundamental to preserving the rule of law, and that is the citizens' ability to turn out office holders who threaten to undermine the rule of law, or who carry out policies, who control governments, without being duly elected in fair, free, and accurate elections. Why? Well, because if the government, you think about this, if the government goes off the rails, and I don't care whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, a Libertarian, a Green, a Bernie-crat, or a Trumpista, you can see my bias there. The fact is that, if you don't have accurate elections, then you cannot turn the bastards out when the government goes off the rails. You might have different opinions about why the government is going off the rails, but you're not going to be able to turn the government out. You're going to be stuck with what you've got. And so it takes you back to the issue that John Stuart Mill cited in his book on liberty, that if you don't have the controls in place, you're going to lose power to tyrants, and tyranny is going to conquer. So the question then is, where's the United States on this issue? I'm going to give you just a smattering of evidence for endemic error, if not fraud, in United States elections. Starting with, well, I can go back. Election fraud has probably been happening since Greek democracy. Okay, it's whenever you get interest groups, parties, even interested individuals with a lot at stake, they're going to want to advance their interests. It's in the nature of people, it's in the nature of animals, to compete, and to try to overcome their opponents. And human beings have a great deal of inventiveness, let's say, as well as the ability to cooperate. And of course, the ability to cooperate is an important feature, of human evolution. The ability to cooperate with other people who have the same interests to conquer their adversaries. And if it means bending the rules a little bit, then typically they'll do it. This is why we have the Securities and Exchange Commission to control public corporations, to say, okay, we're going to audit you every 3 months to make sure you're staying within the lanes. And we don't do that with elections. And arguably, there is no public company in the United States, including Apple, one of the biggest companies in the world, that if it committed fraud, it would have more impact than electing a president or putting in office a president and a Congress who were not duly elected. Right? So, what happens when we get people in office who do not owe their allegiance to the citizenry? We get policies that are not agreed to by the majority of citizens. Now that may work out for a little while. It may work out very nicely. If the person or people governing remain close enough, let's say, to the center. I mean, JFK purportedly, John F. Kennedy purportedly won his election in 1960 with the help of fraud in Texas and Chicago. Nixon arguably won that election. What we got instead was a president, who was very charismatic, who nevertheless, in spite of his close victory, never claimed an absolute mandate like we've seen with Trump and Bush. Instead, attempted to build a coalition of people across the American spectrum, in order to develop policies that most Americans could agree with, even though he may not have won the election. What we're seeing in recent years, because of the hyper-partisan politics in the United States, is presidents who get into office with the narrowest of margins and then claim a powerful mandate. Now, how narrow are the margins? In Florida in 2000, the Supreme Court selected George W. Bush to be president. It did so on the basis of a 537 vote margin, which is statistically insignificant. You know, and we got a president who took us into 2 wars, which we're still paying for, incidentally, in a variety of ways. In that election, the Secretary of State of Florida systematically reduced the voting rolls of ex-felons who had had their civil rights restored and therefore had the right to vote. And Florida at the time did not grant the right to vote to ex-felons, but people from other states, felons from other states, did. And so she took those people off the rolls in spite of the fact that they had had their civil rights restored in their states of origin. She did computer matches using the first 3 letters of people's names, which caused over-retrieval of matches, which had the effect of reducing the voting strength of the Black community and the Latino community, because the names that were most common were Black and Latino names. Those are categories who vote mostly Democratic. The estimates are that between 50 and 100,000 people were removed from the rolls that way. Now that's actually fairly mediocre in today's landscape. Now it's common to take 300,000 people or more off the rolls. Both in Democrats and Republicans alike do it. In the Bernie-Hillary primary 2 years ago in New York, Brooklyn knocked 128,000 brand new registrants off the rolls. Now they knew that they were going to vote for Bernie, because why else would they be registering in the same day or a few days before the election, and just coming out of the walls? They were going to vote for somebody that the establishment of the Democratic Party didn't want them to vote for. So it doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican. If you're a member of a social organization that wants to survive, you're going to bend rules to survive unless there's some strong restriction that prevents you from doing that. In 2004, and this is how I got started in this project, in 2004, Bush was expected to lose Ohio by 1 million votes. The exit polls in Ohio showed him losing by 1 million votes. At about 11 o'clock in the evening, the Secretary of State's website crashed. It came out later that there was a backup website that had been built by an associate of Karl Rove, who was Bush's political advisor. The results that had been rolling in statewide, 52 to 48 against Bush, flipped in 2 minutes and started coming in 52 to 48 for Bush. And he won that state by 100,000 votes, officially. He won the Electoral College by 2 votes, with Ohio's votes. There was a lawsuit afterwards by a colleague of mine who, in that lawsuit, they managed to pull out facts that the Secretary of State had built this parallel website, this mirror site, using Republican Party resources, and that the website was controlled out of Kentucky, and all the electoral data was flowing from precincts, not to the Registrar of Voters or to the Secretary of State. It was flowing straight into the basement of a building in Kentucky, controlled by Karl Rove, and it was coming back to the website without ever having passed through state hands. Now, we can speculate about whether there was fraud involved or not, right? In the lawsuit in federal district court in Ohio, the federal judge eventually ordered all of the counties in Ohio to turn over all of their election records. That means ballots, receipts, the tally sheets, all the records. Those records were required by federal law, as they still are, to be kept for 22 months. In other words, 2 months before the next election. The Secretary of State, Republican, very partisan, hyper-partisan Republican Secretary of State that year, gave using a ruse, gave permission to a number of registrars of voters in the counties to destroy their records. Some of them destroyed using that ruse, but all of the states that were all of the counties that were suspected of fraud had mysterious fires, floods, storage issues, and not one of them was able to return an ounce of legally required voting records in order for it to be examined. So the evidence was utterly destroyed. So there's no way to check back on it, right? A couple of people went to jail for destruction of state evidence. An unindicted co-conspirator in the case is now our registrar of voters here in San Diego, Mr. View. I don't have no idea whether he's changed his ways. There's some evidence to suggest that he plays a little loose at times. This election, I would say that I can argue this, I think, fairly convincingly, that we do not know mathematically, we do not know who won the Electoral College in this last presidential race. For this reason. In Michigan, Trump's margin was 0.22%, 10,000 votes. A registrar of voters, who's the head of a voting officials organization in Michigan, has said publicly, and I have not seen the official reports that the testing reports that she has cited, but she has said that in independent tests of the Scantrons that process the paper ballots like ours in Michigan, that they test regularly between 0.75 and 2.5% error rates. So 0.22% within a 1+% error rate is, you don't know. Who the hell knows, who won that election in Michigan? But there was a big fight to prevent a recount of the ballots. There was now, it's not all on the Republican side. Democrats in Wayne County, which is Detroit, Hillary won Wayne County with about 98% of the vote. That's really interesting. I mean, maybe it's possible. I can imagine some New England towns, where all Republicans or all Democrats would live, and maybe there'd be an odd Republican or Democrat. But a whole city with only 2% Republicans, that's kind of doubtful. And when they started the recount, they found that a number of, about almost half, 48% of the precinct's boxes had their seals broken or other problems with them, such that under Michigan law, they were unrecountable. And because they were unrecountable, the legal count had to be the count that had been first done at the precinct place, at the polling place. As a result, you have this perverse incentive that if you count wrong in a hyper-partisan county, all you have to do is clip the seal and it becomes the permanent count, right? So in Wisconsin, there was a new voter ID law, and it took, they purportedly about 300,000 people off the rolls. Most of them probably would have voted Democratic because they were mostly minorities that were taken off the rolls. A University of Wisconsin, Madison, a couple of professors of statistics did a study, very serious study. You can read it online. I've studied the methodology. It's a good, solid methodology. Using conservative figures, interviewing 2,500 people, which is a very large sample, in 2 counties, of interviewing only voters who had an unbroken record of voting and yet mysteriously did not vote in this election that had so much import. They found that the 2 major reasons for not voting by these people, were A, I was told I couldn't vote, so I didn't bother to try, or B, I tried to vote and I was told I couldn't vote, so I didn't vote. And in those 2 counties alone, now let me back up. Wisconsin's margin was 22,700 for Trump. In those two counties alone, these two statisticians estimated conservatively that somewhere around 28,000 people had not voted. We didn't ask them how they would have voted, but they were minority communities, chances are they would have voted, you know, not in block, you know, the majority probably for Hillary. Is that, you know, so, you know, it says something. You know, in Pennsylvania, 80%, the margin there was 50,000 votes. The 80% of the polling places in Pennsylvania are electronic touchscreen voting with no receipts. So there's no way to trace or to verify the accuracy of the vote. 50,000 votes, you know, divided by the number of precincts that use those particular kind of machines adds up to about 5 votes per precinct. That's easy, really easy to manage, you know, with some simple tricks. And you've probably all seen YouTube videos, you know, of people hacking the machines, you know, in 2 minutes. You know, it's really easy for amateurs to do this. Okay, so basically, you know, the problem is, look, I'm representing, you know, the company that I'm running. It's a nonprofit tech startup called Democracy Counts. It's been around for 3 years now. We ran a trial 2 years ago in the primary in California. We ran another trial in Broward County a couple of months ago. I was there for all that fun. It was really an eye-opening. You know, it's brass knuckle politics there. It makes California politics look tame, I tell you. You know, we do not, you know, we will not ever be saying with any degree of certainty that that if we find serious error that it was caused by fraud, because our evidence will never say, that if something happens, if the data shows an error, a discrepancy, that fraud caused it. What we're going to be doing is giving our data when we run audits, because this is what we're about. We develop tools for running same-day election audits so that people can go into court, injured parties, candidates, community organizations, whatever, that they can go into court the very next day or very soon with our data and lay out a case before a judge and say, Your Honor, there are discrepancies here that need to be explained. We'd like an injunction against certification of the election pending investigation of, and an explanation of these discrepancies. And if it turns out to be fraud, or if it turns out to be simple error, then there's something to be done about it before the candidates take office. Because once candidates take office, it's really, really difficult to get them out of office. You have to show extraordinary fraud. Yes? So
how does the technology exactly work?
I'll get to that in just a second, because that's what the slideshow's about. Actually, I'll just start now. So, we're using mobile devices. What we're doing, is there's nothing really. All of you are familiar with apps. We've developed a fairly complex app because there's so many security concerns involved in this. And we've got to use citizen auditors. So we've got to, try to maintain data integrity at the same time as we are, making it easy for citizens to do something, because we can't do it all. We'll never be able to do it all. We're estimating that if we have to pay people, it will cost well over $1 million a state to do one audit in one election. So we've developed this technology so that it can, that it can spread, perhaps virally, if people are interested, so that anybody can sign up to do an audit. It's like if you can organize a birthday party, you can organize an audit of a polling place. It's that easy. Now, it's not that it's not work, because it takes a full day to do it, but, it's all set up for you. So So let's go to the next slide. Okay, that's our mission statement. We're a nonprofit tech startup pioneering same-day CPA quality audits of elections to ensure that people who take office were genuinely elected. So we're setting up really solid audit procedures. In a zone, and this is a field that nobody's ever really worked in before. So go ahead. Keep going. I've already spoken to this. So here we go. Here's our three major tools. We've got a data preservation app, which basically anybody can use. Our auditors will use it, of course. But anybody who's even not an auditor, hopefully, for instance, precinct captains for the parties, they can go to the polling place that they're responsible for already, or any voter can take pictures of the polling tapes that are put out. In most precincts in the United States, they do a count in the polling place. Arizona is an exception, and then they post the results on the doors or on the windows or something. And it's very common. I'll come back to you in a second. And it's very common for unusual results to be reported on the state website. And then people go back later and say, and dig into the records, and they discover that the original receipts are not the same, as what was reported on the website. And sometimes those errors can be quite large. In 2000, Gore was about ready to concede because he was 13,000 votes behind from a particular county, which made somebody smell something. And so this aide dug into it, and he did his own addition. And he realized that those 13,000 votes were error. And he reported it to Gore. It was reported to the Secretary of State. They said, "Oh, sorry, data entry error," or something like that. And he retracted. He stood down from conceding the race, which of course ended up being his 500 vote margin. What we do there with that is that we take the pictures. The pictures and we manually enter the data for the races we're following, just the top of the ballot races. And and then those are basically go into our system so that when the results are reported on the website or in whatever other means that they use, it's usually the website, we can then compare them. And if there's a discrepancy, they should always be identical. There should be no discrepancies because these are supposed to be perfect records, of what the precincts are reporting. And what we found, now this is very interesting, we designed this tool, from a kind of California politics perspective. I'm a political scientist. I've studied elections in other countries, Nicaragua, Taiwan, Chile, other places. I have some exposure via a friend who was a presidential candidate in Gabon, where people get killed for being on the wrong side of the party divide. And in fact, he was poisoned and almost killed. It's like rough politics doesn't surprise me. But still in all, I had this unexamined assumption when I designed this tool that bureaucracies in the United States would behave nominally like they're supposed to, and if they're going to screw around, they're going to do it kind of covertly. What we found in Florida was really interesting, at least in Broward County. Not all the counties like that. Broward County is a Democratic county. So we did this tool, we conducted this tool, we used this tool, and we got results from about 30 precincts. We had very small turnout of volunteers, and we didn't have enough money to hire a bunch of extra people. So out of about 200 precincts, we had about 30. Now, the report on the website, the database shows normally, it shows early voting, same-day voting, election day voting, provisional votes, and mail-in ballots. And those four go to the total for that precinct. The website had all of the totals laid out there, but it was missing about 90% of the data for the subtotals. Now, they knew we were operating there. All the other elections we looked at, they had all the data. But in the election we were looking at, almost all the data was missing. Now, it turned out that there were a couple of precincts where the data was reported, and we had our own data for those 2 precincts. There was no relationship between the data at all. No relationship. We couldn't make one number match. Now, that's just 2 precincts, so it doesn't hold any legal weight. But it really does raise the eyebrows. It raises the eyebrows a little more when you take into account the fact that in the second place where we were conducting this exit vote app, this parallel vote app, the police were called on us twice. I was threatened with arrest in the morning. It was kind of interesting, a few butterflies in the stomach dealing with that one. But eventually the cops realized that we were within the law, and they cheered up and said, "Okay, do what you want. You're fine." The second time, when the police were called, the polling official, as he was going back into the building after the sheriff's officer had turned him down in his request to get rid of us, he stopped and he turned to me and said, "Are you going to be using that data preservation app that you talk about on your website?" And I said, "Yes." And I think, I should have lied, and I'm not devious enough for that. Because he said, "Oh, okay, thank you." I said, "What's that?" Well, the next morning, that night we had people out taking pictures of the tapes and entering the data. And in 9 of 11 precincts, we got data. The next day, 50% of the tapes were missing, and the next day there were none. And our volunteers asked employees when they could find them, who took the tapes down? Because normally they're required by the regulations to stick the tapes up, but there's no instruction to take them down. Normally employees, of the school or library or whatever will leave them up for a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week, whatever, and then they'll take them down. And one employee said, "We're not going to be in trouble, are we, for taking them down early?" "Oh, no, that's, there's no requirement for that." But who took them down? Well, they all said, it's a handful, we didn't have employees to talk to everywhere. They all said that elections officials came, where election workers came, and took them down. Why? Well, we can only speculate, but we know what we know what the motives are. There's in the law, prosecutors and fraud-oriented lawyers, forensic lawyers, they say, if there's means, motive, and opportunity, the only thing keeping a crime from happening, is the character of the people, right? If somebody's ethical, they'll ignore means, motive, and opportunity, and they'll still stay within their lanes. But if they've got strong interests, they've got motive, they've got means, they've got the opportunity to commit fraud, to commit election fraud, and their jobs depend on it, the candidate they're supporting depends on it, then, what's the odds that something snooky is going on? Okay, so we were actually having to do something. The tool is good, but we found that in Florida anyway, in these hardball politics areas, it's like, I seriously, honest to God, naively thought that the bureaucracy would report the data, and we'd be able to do our job, and that they'd cook the data underneath somewhere if they were going to do it. Instead, they just didn't report the data, and it was like saying to us, well, so sue us. Well, so we're going to have to set up legal teams to do just that. I really didn't want to set up legal teams, as part, because it's just an extra cost and it's an extra hassle. But it looks like we're going to have to do that. The exit vote app is interesting. That's the best tool, but it's the hardest work. So if basically that data preservation app, it takes the data from the polling place, and it makes sure that from the polling place to the report that there's no man-in-the-middle attack like in Ohio. And this is where the project got started, because I wanted to eliminate man-in-the-middle attacks. But what's the way of making sure that the data coming out of the polling place is actually good data? And that's where the exit vote app, the parallel vote app, comes in. The idea is that people go into the polling place, they vote however they vote, They come out and they vote again on our system. Our system is extremely robust. It's extremely security conscious. It's transparent and verifiable. We're using highest levels of NSA grade secure hash algorithms, to encrypt all of our data and to make sure that it stays good throughout the process. And then independent experts, can verify that in court, that our data is probably pretty good. So the official systems, which tend to be not very good, and also they tend to be proprietary, so nobody really knows what's going on inside, that as, if you're going to compare between a system that you can see clearly is solid and robust, and the other one they're saying, well, you can't look at it, you can't look at the code, then the judge is going to say, okay, I believe, this. Hopefully the judge will say that. We're not going to always win. Anyway, the idea there is that if there are discrepancies between our data and their data, then that gives an injured party grounds to say, Your Honor, we'd like an injunction. Now, the discrepancies are special kinds of discrepancies. We're never going to have 100% participation. When we trialed this in 3 cities in California in 2016, we had well over 90% participation with no prior voter education, no signage, no nothing, just T-shirts and a little flyer like that, and people walking up and saying, we're doing X, would you participate? And they read the little flyer and they come out and they say, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Now in Florida, we did the same thing in 2 precincts, in 2 polling places, and the Floridians were like, what's this? It's like, so it's like there's a culture change here that we didn't expect. I mean, the polling, I had a very hot debate with an exit pollster in 2016 before we ran our trial, who said, you're never going to get the kind of high percentages you need, well into the 90 percentiles, to do this, because we never get more than 30 to 50%. And I said, well, we'll try. And we got really high percentages, and it really gave us a lot of confidence. And then in Florida, it destroyed our confidence all over again. And so the lesson there is, we got to do, in 2020 and going forward, we've got to do a lot of community organizing, a lot of community outreach, working with civic groups, Kiwanis groups, et cetera, to make sure that there's plenty of knowledge by voters what it is, so that when they see the people standing outside the polling place, they'll participate. Yeah, actually, wait a minute, she had a question, so I want to get back to her question.
Oh, sorry, I was just stretching.
Oh, okay. No, I thought you were okay, yeah, go ahead.
How does the exit vote app work with different types of ballots, not just go to the polling place and fill out the ballot? Or mail in and all the different types of ballots that you're not physically there.
Right. It doesn't right now. We're, as a startup, we have to focus narrowly, on basically the low-hanging fruit. And the low-hanging fruit, the place where, enough data comes together into kind of a bottleneck, which is the polling place, that's what we're concentrating on. The mail-in ballots, we don't have a way to do that yet. We're hoping that with time, that people, with popularity, it's kind of like a recycling program. Eventually, people kind of get the message, they get with the program. Eventually, over several elections, hopefully, people will get with the program, and we'll be able to put the program online, this particular thing online, so that if you voted by mail, you can verify that, provide your identity, and so on, and even basically vote again online, and then in those precincts where we have a high enough participation rate, then it contributes that much more to the data flow and the data certainty. So right now, it's not our minimum viable product. Our minimum viable product is these 3 things. Now the voter suppression app is really interesting. It's a very potentially an extremely powerful tool. You probably read about voter suppression in Alabama and Georgia and so on. Where you've got close races. If you can take tens or hundreds of thousands of people off the opposition rolls, you've got it made in the shade. What our voter suppression app does is basically it's a rework of the exit vote app. It's basically the same thing except that it is intended to be used to query voters or, or probable voters, people who wanted to vote but couldn't vote, to ask them to vote as, in our system, as if as they would have voted had they been voting in the official system. Now, what this does is it produces data that judges can listen to. This is, like our entire strategy is based on the idea that if you're honest and clean and produce good data, direct evidence of something that's going on, judges are not just going to flip you off. It's going to be like an uphill struggle, to convince a judge, but you're never going to convince a judge if you don't have good data. So in Wisconsin, for instance, if we'd been in Wisconsin and we had produced evidence from non-voters who wanted to vote, let's say, okay, we know that the margin was 22,000. Suppose that we've gotten 20,000 voters to say that I would have voted for Hillary had I been permitted to vote. That does two things in court. One is it shows that the outcome may have changed had they been able to vote. So that establishes that the official system is in question. And because judges always ask that. If you come in and you say, if there are 15 people who say they were denied the right to vote, the judge says two things. One, there's no constitutional violation because the vote is not guaranteed in the federal country. Nowhere in the federal Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, is voting mentioned. It's all left up to the states. So you don't have a right to vote like you have a right to non-discrimination. So what it gives, and if it's 15 people who said, well, it wouldn't have affected the election anyway. So why are you wasting the court's time? So, you're not injured personally very much, and you certainly haven't shown an injury to the public weal. So what we do is we say, okay, if we've got 20,000 people in the plaintiff class, because we know all the people who are voting. The apps are set up so that these two apps, people identify themselves, and they sign a little affidavit saying, I voted the same way inside as I voted outside. And we know their personal information enough to be able to contact them again after, or if the lawyers could contact them after and say, would you mind being a plaintiff in the suit? So suddenly, if you have 20,000 people in the plaintiff class, there's no question that there's an injury. And there's no question in that kind of a case where you show that, look, conservatively, Your Honor, here we've gotten 20,000 people, and there's probably another 20 or 50 or 100,000 out there. It could have affected the election. And there's been a serious constitutional injury. So you've got standing to stay in court, and now you can argue the case, which of course makes it a public matter. So two things happen. One is you educate the public, which creates hopefully pressure for reform, and for movement against, these kinds of problems. But you also upset the political class, because what happens when you're a candidate and you think you won the election, and suddenly a judge, has said, no, I'm not going to let this election be certified. We're going to have an investigation. And suddenly, all your plans, your expectation of achieving a higher level of power, all of your followers are depending on that. The apartments you've rented in the capital city, your expected salary, you've quit your previous job, you've been hobnobbing with the next people up, in the hierarchy. All of that stuff just suddenly becomes iffy. And the party involved, the political party, then of course sees its margins potentially shrinking. And so it's basically it creates it creates a political crisis in the party structure. Yeah.
You mentioned trial runs. Have the voter suppression app and the exit voter app been effective in accumulating significant amounts of data that show
Not yet.
not the numbers
So
needed?
the trials haven't been big enough.
Okay.
Yeah. So this gets to a practical problem. And here we are doing something that arguably is, kind of important, and it should be kind of important to candidates who are challenging the establishment. If they're Republicans, let's say moderate Republicans challenging a extreme right-wing Republican establishment in the area because they want to moderate their party a little bit, or say they're Bernie-crats, they're challenging the Democratic establishment in the primaries, or let's say it's the Democrats challenging the Republicans in a red state, or the Republicans challenging the Democrats in a blue state. The point is that you've got challengers who have reason to believe that that there may be a finger on the scale. And so you'd think that that politicians would be saying, oh my God, I need an insurance policy to make sure that the referee doesn't call the game for my opponent after I've done all this work and spent 2 years of my life and my personal fortune, and then the referee takes it away from me, after I've sacrificed so much and my followers have sacrificed so much and so on and so forth. And I think I won, and I'm not being permitted to show that I won, right? You'd think that would produce customers for this. Well, it turns out it's a very hard sale. And I think it's a hard sale for 2 reasons. One is because budgets are always limited. Candidates usually raise barely enough money, to run their race. Raise another 10% or something to pay for an audit. And B, I heard this from a Democratic consultant who was, I asked this question directly to somebody. She had been an aide to one of the state assembly or state senate members, and then she went off privately, and now she's a consultant for Democratic candidates. And I asked, what about fraud? This was in 2016, looking forward to Trump's election. And she said, geez, I've never thought about this. I'm not sure I even want to think about it. I mean, we depend on the system, to function properly. And if it doesn't function properly, oh my God, what can we do? It's like, I don't think I want to even think about this. So it's very unsettling. The last thing you want is for people to, is for your clients to be, filled with anxiety. You want to run the race the way you expect to run it.
So what if you find that unsettling discoveries? What if you find that the data doesn't match the what's being reported?
Mm-hmm.
How do you go to the courts and say that there's actual fraud? Because all you have...
Well, we don't. What we do is we go to the courts, or actually the injured party goes to the courts, and we back them up with expert testimony as to how the data was collected and so on. And the injured party makes the argument that there may be fraud, Your Honor, or at least certainly there's error or there's discrepancies need to be explained. Because if the discrepancies aren't explained, then you're allowing potential error that could possibly change the outcome of the election to remain. And therefore, the public service that's provided by the government in this case, is not being provided. Its duty is being violated. So
and the courts order recount?
No. Well, that's one of the possibilities. What I advise, we were, one of the races we audited was Tim Canova. He was running against Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who was the DNC chairman, who rigged the system, for Hillary against Bernie in the primaries. And so he ran and almost beat her. Who knows whether he actually beat her or not, but all the records were destroyed a few months after the election. But he ran again this time. And I advised him to lay out for a judge a kind of a graded system of actions that judges could take. So the first would be to order, a kind of a random recount, what's called a risk limiting audit. So basically go in there and count random precincts very carefully. It's not too expensive. You can do a few dozen, and it'll tell you if there's something going on, if it's done right. It can be rigged, so you've got to have independent people doing it. So that's the cheapest way to do it. And then I suggested that if it comes back suspicious, then the judge can order either a full recount, or he can say, okay, I'm not going to certify this, I'm going to issue a permanent injunction. I mean, it's not permanent, but it's like goes longer than 30 days. A temporary injunction is 30 days. I'm going to issue an injunction pending the Attorney General's investigation of what's going on. At that point, the Attorney General, can send his or her professional investigators in who can just sweep up all the records before they have a chance to mess with them. Computers, emails, receipts, tally sheets, all of those things, just sweep them up because they're state property. They don't need discovery orders, they don't need subpoenas, nothing, right? And most of the people who work for Attorney General, and the Attorney General is a partisan office, but the staff is professional. I mean, they might be Republicans or Democrats, but they've got to work together and they've established professional, relationships. So they're going to do a professional job. And it may not be comfortable for the Attorney General, it may not be comfortable for the ruling party, but it's going to be more likely to produce empirical evidence of what went on, which could result in the judgment or the interpretation of the data or the evidence. I mean, if you find emails saying, do this, do that, and it's like clearly illegal, you see people conspiring, then you can point your finger at fraud, because fraud is a criminal offense that requires the element of intention. Just looking at the data, you can't say anything about intent. So, okay, more question. We've got 15 minutes?
Well, I actually, several of you in this class have worked the polls. Raise your hand if you've been somebody who's worked the polls. Okay, so as a poll worker, in terms of, as somebody who has worked the polls, who spent a full day, or have you both done it twice?
Yeah, I did it once.
You did it once, you did it twice. How can you speak to the process is so decentralized that within that there are, giving you anything to start with?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I can see how easy it would be to not put ballots in, or to I don't know, having been there and done it, and I've seen how many people are in the process and how many different parts there are, it doesn't surprise me at all that there are situations in which people aren't honest and whatever it was just didn't report the data, or because there's so many moving parts. And I mean, it makes me upset that they would do that, of course, but it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, I agree, because when I was working it, there was the task of counting the specific types of ballots was kind of split between poll workers, and I can see that if a certain person was just trying to not be honest, they could have easily even reported how many ballots were there wrong, or made a mistake or something.
Yeah. There was, I talked with a guy who's a lawyer who did some investigation of election fraud some years ago, and he's from Chicago. And he said there was a guy in our area, he counted ballots. And he was known, his nickname was Mr. Graphite or something like that, because he grew one fingernail long and he put a pencil lead underneath it. So when he saw a ballot, when he was counting it, if he saw a ballot that disagreed with the result he was trying to obtain, that he put a little stray mark on it and would disqualify the ballot, so he'd get to throw it away. There's all these little tricks, I mean, the most effective trick is to flip ballots, to flip votes, because if you can change, and this is more difficult to do in paper ballot days, because if you have a paper ballot that has candidate X and you want candidate Y to win, then you have to have an identical ballot that has candidate Y on it, and you have to kind of palm the one and put the other in. So that used to be very common. It's possible that it's being done all the time with computers because it's simply a matter of code. A computer company, voting, election software and hardware company employee, an IT guy, testified to the Congress in the early 2000s that he was asked by the CEO of this company in Florida to write some code that would flip a certain number of votes for a certain candidate. He said, he testified that he thought that it was like an exercise that he was being given. And so he did it. It took about 100 lines of code, and at the end of the code, he had it set up so that it would erase itself afterwards. So there'd never be any proof of it. The sub-programs, the subroutines would just disappear, and you wouldn't be able to trace it. And excuse me. So he took it to the CEO, and the CEO, and he said, "Here it is. It's doable. And so what else do you want me to do?" And he said, "I want you to implement it." I said, "I can't implement that. That's wrong." He said, "Well, this congressional candidate is our client, and that's what he wants. I'm sorry, I'm quitting." So he quit. Now, for me as an IT guy with a kind of my, I was joking. I joke with friends that I don't think I've worked and done political science in a country without being apprehended, detained, or arrested at least once. Okay, so I have this kind of like, stumble into things because I'm too interested in certain issues. For me, it would have been like, okay, I'll do that, and then gather all the evidence, stay on the job for another 3 weeks, and pull it all together, and then carry it off to, a federal attorney. That's not what he did, unfortunately. But he's an IT guy. He's not a political activist, like me. But yeah, it's very easy to do, and it's easier to do with computers now than ever, because you have one person sitting at a keyboard managing an entire election. Just a second. A friend of mine, my oldest friend in San Diego, a woman named Faye Krevicek, she's the PR guy for Wild Coast, which is busy saving coastline up and down Mexico and California. She worked for Gobernación in Mexico under the PRI, Partido Revolucionario Institucional, and as an employee of Gobernación, which is kind of like the State Department but internal in the Mexican system, she actually walked in on the room where they had all these computer screens laid out, and they were managing the vote in all over Mexico. It didn't matter how people voted. They knew how they wanted it to come out, so they were just managing it with keyboards. And they had deals. The PRI was very sophisticated. They would say, okay, we're going to win this election, but we need to give so many seats to this opposition party because we bought them off, and so many seats to this opposition party because if we don't give them, basically the idea is an old tradition in Mexico. It goes back to the revolution. The ballot, they say a cannonball is worth 50,000 pesos. Basically, the idea is that you go to a candidate who's pushing for some kind of populist cause, and you say, you've got a choice. You can go ahead and contest it. You can ignore what we're up to. And you'll face consequences. We know where you live. We know where your kids are. Or you can take some money, and we'll put you in Congress. You'll be a minority, but your voice will be heard. But we'll stay in power. And that was the way it worked. And she walked into the room where all the computers were laid out. Now, I've had conversation with Americans, who, and these days, most of the people I talk with say, it's like, what you're doing is really important. I really don't trust the election system. But I still have conversations occasionally with people who are like, say, you're crazy. People don't do that in America. Like, you're talking about conspiracy. You're talking about criminal fraud and so on. And I say, yeah. It's not like it's everywhere. But it doesn't have to be everywhere. It only has to be in the swing states in the presidential election because that's what swings the Electoral College under our system. It doesn't matter how you vote in California, Ohio, or Wisconsin, or Florida, or maybe New Mexico even, is going to determine who's president. That's it. So we've got, a smaller job than we would have otherwise. Now, local races are a different matter. You may still need to control for that. So go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, you talk about the practicality. Obviously, the audit system can't be used today.
Right.
But in the meantime, would it be better to make the system transparent, to make the computers open source, to make the system open for everyone to look at, or will that increase the fraud, the hacking?
Well, okay, so open source, we've dealt with this question. We're eventually gonna migrate to open source programs. And we'll eventually also migrate a part of the storage system, at least, to blockchain, so that it's utterly transparent. But, open source has strengths and weaknesses. Its strength is that if it's got a large community of supporters who can plug holes, can stop zero-day exploits and so on, that it can be done very fast, because essentially the IT department of a good open source program like Linux, is just massive. I mean, it can defeat any corporate attempt because there are more people. They're spending a little bit of time, but they can take care of these things. The weakness of open source is if you don't have that large community, you're screwed. Because, a well-funded hacker, or say dozens of hackers, can overwhelm your public IT team. So that's why we're not open source yet. We're waiting to become popular so that when we're ready, when we've got a lot of people who believe in us, then we'll go fully open source, and they'll be able to back us up. But now the question about changing the system, changing the software so it's more transparent, reforming the system. This is the debate we've had. That we're not, believe it or not, we are not well liked in the election integrity community. I mean, people like you, people I run into, voters, almost everybody I run into, including some political candidates now, and officials, say this is a really good idea. But people in the election integrity movement, almost uniformly don't like what we're doing. Because, this is very funny, you'd think, we're all wearing white hats, right? Well, guess what? People wearing white hats still have parochial interests. They still have their own nonprofit that they're trying to push. They still have their own strategy that they're trying to push. And they don't get what we're doing. Most of the people in the election integrity movement want paper ballots. And I've actually seen emails that were shared with me by important people in the election integrity movement saying what Democracy Counts is doing is going to damage what we're doing because it's going to set back our crusade for paper ballots. Now, I think that's completely incorrect because what we're doing, in fact, we're helping them. We view our role not as reformers like they are. They are trying to reform the system, get paper ballots, get things done right. The problem is that the public officials who are already, kind of in the white, they're going to adopt reforms because they're already working inside of a clean system and they want to improve it. Up in Humboldt County, they've got a really great system, and all the public officials are behind it. But go to Chicago, go to Albany, go to Georgia, you think the public officials there are going to adopt the reforms that everybody's screaming for? Heck no, this is what put them in office. This is how they stay in office. So the problem with the strategy of lobbying for reform in the election system is that the very people who need it most are the ones who are least likely to agree, unless they are put into a corner and they have no choice but to make the change. So what we're doing is by being able to produce data, and we are ready to do it. It's like we're redoing the app again. But by producing data that can upset the status quo, that can throw everybody off balance, that can produce political crisis, that can produce, incredibly viral, public relations disasters for fraudsters or for parties that support the system. What that does, it's like the point of the spear. It opens political space by putting defenders of the status quo back on their heels. And if they're back on their heels and they're playing defense, then the lobbyists for reform organizations can crowd into that space and say, we've got a solution. At that point, we're out of the picture. We're happy to provide data, but lobbying is not our thing. Our niche is very narrow. It's to be the point of the spear to upset the status quo. Once the status quo is upset, then our friends and compadres, in the election integrity movement, whether they like us or not, I don't care. Okay, I'm used to that. I'm used to doing unpopular stuff. Once we do our job, they crowd in and they make the changes in the law and in the purchasing of equipment and so on and so forth, so it's taken care of. So it's a kind of a 2 or 3 stage process.
Can you give us a sense of how many people you've had operating, and has it just been in Florida, or?
Well, as a nonprofit, we're a hybrid, weird creature. The numbers fluctuate. So as it gets close to the election, then people get more and more interested. So we had 100 and something people sign up in Florida to work with us. We ran a social media campaign to recruit people. When we got there, 18 said that they would come to the training session and 2 showed up. This is one of the reasons why we've got to raise a lot more money. We've got to put something on the table for people who might blow it off otherwise. Our own team varies in size. Again, it also fluctuates because at this point we're all volunteers. So there's me, there's Ann Wayman, who's our COO. We have a couple advisors who are constantly with us. We have, depending on the day of the week, we've got between 1 and 5 IT people, coders, programmers, developers, and they come and go as well. Our database guy works for a contractor who works for the Navy. He regularly does this super high security, high-powered database stuff. So he's kind of our back office, our back end guy, and he's been there for more than 2 years. Ultimately, I've done an org chart of a hypothetical state audit, and to be done right. And if you figure that, let's say on average, you need 10 people per polling place, and if you want to do 25% of the polling places in the state, and there's say 5,000 polling places, that's a lot of people. Now, the Data Preservation Act can be done like 1 person per 10 polling places, and it just takes an evening. That's it. Or if it's assigned to, we're probably going to take this Data Preservation Act and break it out from our own system and release it as a freestanding app, so that anybody can download it on their phone, and then they go back to the polling place. And if we get multiple data entries for the same polling place, that's not a problem, because they'll all line up. If they don't, it gives us something to look at. But if we've got multiple eyes looking at the polling tapes, then and the data flows in, and the way it works is that the picture of the tapes and the entry, the manual entry, are tied together, cyber-wise, and encrypted together. Then we look at the digital data and compare it, and if there's a discrepancy, we go back and look at the photograph to make sure the digital data reflects the photograph. And there's no way to break this stuff. I mean, this year we used an SSL 256 bank level. It's like it's the HTTPS security level, and that's all right because we were doing a trial. When we're eventually in it, and like billions of dollars are at stake, for in a presidential election. At that point, we're going to be using, what's called SHA 520 or 512 or 1024, which is the highest NSA level secure hashing algorithm. So, our security is going to be really strong, and it's got to be, because we expect that there could be some very well-funded attackers. Our goal, and I'll end it at this, our goal in 2020 is to facilitate and cause and organize audits in all of the swing states, so that we can be sure that the president who takes office is the president who's genuinely elected in an accurate election. It's rather audacious. It scares the bloody hell out of me.
How many people would that be? How many volunteers would that be operating?
Tens of
on the
thousands
ground?
in total.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to open a campaign office in every state. We're gonna have to have a campaign manager who's had experience running political campaigns, probably at the government, at the state level, because it's a state level. I mean, it's gonna look kind of like a political campaign, except people are gonna be doing different things from politics. There's gonna be legal teams per state. There's gonna be analytic teams per state, because we have to be the people eyeballing this data and running statistical tests, some of which we recognize, and a lot of which require judgment calls. So and there's going to be security. You know, at the point where we're a threat to the establishment, I will probably have to be under 24/7 security. You know, we're gonna have to. We've got it in the budget. You know, it's expensive. We're going to have people looking at the threat environment to make sure that our personnel are protected. We're going to have roving security, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be messy.
Wow.
So.
Well, Dan, thank you very much. This is fascinating. And yeah, well, we will continue to stay in touch with how things roll out.
Blessed with bad eyes. There's a lot that I miss, but I don't mind. I'm not that old. I'll find out what broke me soon.